The house was still dark when I stepped inside, the air cold and wrong, like it had been holding its breath. A lamp was overturned near the door, glass crunching under my shoe, and I remember thinking how quiet everything sounded after the funeral, after the condolences stopped. My hands were shaking, not from fear yet, but from the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones when grief doesn't let you sleep. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt that trust crack in an instant, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not as alone as you think. I stood there, coat still on, staring at the mess, realizing nothing had been stolen, nothing except my sense of safety. The timing was too precise, too calm, to be random. 2 days after I buried my mother, someone I loved decided to show me who they really were. I didn't understand it then, but that night marked the beginning of everything unraveling. 2 days after my mother's funeral, I was still moving through the house like a ghost. I wore black because changing felt impossible. The air smelled faintly of flowers and old coffee, and every room carried the quiet weight of something unfinished. I kept sitting down without realizing why, staring at familiar corners like they might explain how everything could stop so suddenly. That morning, I was at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched, when I felt the shift, not a sound, not a word, just the sense that something was off. He sat across from me instead of beside me. There was space where comfort should have been. His posture was calm, measured, almost rehearsed. And it made my chest tighten before I understood why. What followed didn't explode into anger or tears. It landed softly, carefully, the way bad news does when it's been practiced. I remember noticing how steady he seemed, how prepared. I remember thinking how strange it was that I was still counting the hours since my mother was buried, while he was already counting exits. In that moment, the grief cracked open into something colder. I realized this wasn't clumsy timing or emotional confusion. It was chosen. And as I sat there, numb and exhausted, I understood that to make sense of what was happening, I would have to go back to who I was before everything broke. Before everything broke, my life felt steady in a way I trusted. I liked routines, morning coffee at the same time every day, grocery lists written neatly, folded once, tucked into my bag. I believed consistency was a form of care, that showing up quietly mattered more than grand gestures. I wasn't chasing anything big. I just wanted a life that felt calm and dependable. Our marriage fit neatly into that idea. It wasn't dramatic or fiery, but it was familiar. We shared meals, shared space, shared a rhythm that felt safe. I told myself that comfort was proof of commitment. When things felt flat or distant, I didn't panic. I believed relationships naturally settled, and that patience was how you showed love. If something felt off, I assumed it was my job to smooth it over. I was good at that. Too good. I avoided conflict because I believed peace meant maturity. I explained away discomfort with logic. A tense moment became stress. A sharp comment became a bad day. I told myself not to overthink, not to stir things up unnecessarily. Nothing felt urgent enough to confront, so I didn't. Looking back, I can see the small pauses I ignored, the moments when my stomach tightened for no clear reason, the times I chose calm over curiosity. At the time, everything felt manageable, even normal. I thought stability meant nothing could really go wrong. What I didn't realize was how much my sense of safety had been shaped long before my marriage, by someone who watched quietly, noticed details, and understood that comfort can sometimes hide the earliest warnings. My mother was never loud about the way she loved. She didn't believe in speeches or dramatic warnings. Her presence was steady, almost invisible, the kind that only makes sense once it's gone. She moved through life with quiet intention, paying bills on time, keeping documents organized, noticing details other people overlooked. To me, that was normal. To her, it was protection. She had worked most of her life in jobs that required responsibility and patience, and it showed in how she handled everything. She trusted preparation more than luck. She believed kindness didn't mean carelessness. When I was growing up, she taught me through example, not instruction. I learned to read things carefully before signing, to pause before agreeing, to notice how people behaved when no one was watching. After my father died, it was just the two of us. She carried that loss quietly, never turning it into bitterness. She worked, came home tired, and still made space for me. When I grew up and built a life of my own, she watched from the edges. She never interfered, never criticized outright, but she paid attention, especially to how people spoke about responsibility and money. Every now and then, she would ask me gentle questions that stayed with me longer than answers ever did. Questions about happiness, not excitement or comfort. Questions about whether I felt safe being myself. At the time, I thought she was just being cautious, maybe a little old-fashioned. Looking back, I see something else. I see a woman who understood patterns, who noticed shifts before they became storms. She didn't try to control my choices. She prepared me to survive them. I didn't know it then. But as my life settled into what felt like stability, my mother was already watching the slow changes I was too comfortable to see. The change didn't arrive with an argument or a single moment I could point to. It slipped in slowly, the way habits do, quietly enough that I kept adjusting instead of questioning. At first, it was just comments that felt slightly out of place, casual observations about other people's houses, other people's cars, other people's lives. Nothing sharp, nothing that demanded a response. Money began to show up in our conversations more often, not as a problem, but as a measure, a way of comparing where we were to where we should be. I noticed how success started sounding like something external, something visible. How satisfaction was postponed for a future version of our life that always seemed just out of reach. I told myself this was ambition, that wanting more didn't mean being ungrateful. He started talking about my work differently, too. Not unkindly, just with a tone that suggested it was temporary, something I would outgrow. I felt a small tightening in my chest when those conversations happened, but I ignored it. I reframed it as concern, as encouragement. I reminded myself that marriages shift, that people evolve, and that patience was part of staying connected. What I didn't see then was how often I was adjusting myself to keep things smooth, how often I was explaining away discomfort instead of listening to it. The warmth between us didn't disappear overnight, but it changed texture. It became conditional, quieter, more careful. Looking back, I can see that love was slowly being replaced by comparison, and partnership by accounting. I just didn't have the language for it yet. All I knew was that something fundamental was drifting, and I was working harder and harder to pretend it wasn't. That quiet drift set the stage for the moment when everything else would demand a choice I could no longer soften. The diagnosis came fast and without ceremony. One appointment turned into several, and suddenly my days were measured in hospital hallways, plastic chairs, and the sound of machines I didn't yet understand. My mother's world shrank, and without thinking, mine narrowed with it. I took time off work, I packed overnight bags, I slept where I could, when I could. None of it felt like a decision. It felt instinctive. At first, I told myself we were managing. I was tired, but I believed love made room for that. I believed partnership meant flexibility when life demanded it, but slowly. The tone at home changed. Concern gave way to impatience. Support thinned into questions about when things would go back to normal. I could feel the tension building, not loud, just persistent, like a low hum under everything. One night, after a long day at the hospital, I realized something had shifted. The conversation wasn't about my mother's condition anymore. It was about what my absence meant. About what was being postponed, about who was coming first. In that moment, I understood I wasn't being asked for reassurance. I was being tested for the first time. I didn't soften my response. I didn't explain or apologize. I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that choosing my mother wasn't something I would ever justify. She needed me, and that was enough. The room went quiet after that. Not angry, not explosive, just withdrawn, like someone mentally stepping back and taking notes. I felt it then, deep in my chest, that something essential had cracked. I didn't know how far the consequences would go, but I knew I had crossed a line I wouldn't uncross. That choice stayed with me in the weeks that followed. As my mother's health declined and the space between us grew colder, setting the stage for a loss I wasn't yet ready to face. The days after the funeral blurred together in a way I still struggle to describe. I was moving through the house in borrowed clothes and borrowed time, surrounded by flowers that were already wilting. Grief felt physical then, heavy in my chest, slow in my limbs. I kept expecting my mother to be somewhere nearby, just out of sight. And every realization that she wasn't landed like a second loss, I hadn't slept much. I was still wearing black because deciding otherwise felt disrespectful, like moving forward too soon. The house smelled faintly of food people had brought and forgotten to take home. Everything felt paused, suspended in that strange space where the world keeps going, but you don't. That was when he sat across from me, not beside me. I noticed that detail first, the distance, the way his posture was composed, almost formal. What followed didn't register immediately. It arrived quietly, carefully, like something he'd practiced saying. I remember thinking how odd it was that he seemed so steady when I could barely keep my hands still. The meaning took time to settle. At first, it felt unreal, like words spoken in the wrong room on the wrong day. Then the timing began to echo. 2 days, that was all the space he'd allowed for my grief before choosing himself. What chilled me wasn't the request itself, it was the calm behind it, the sense that this moment hadn't been triggered by loss, but scheduled around it. As I sat there, exhausted and hollow, I understood something painful and clear. This wasn't the end of my marriage because my mother had died. It was the beginning of something that had been waiting patiently for her to be gone. The morning after he asked for a separation, grief barely had time to settle before it was pushed aside by logistics. Papers appeared, timelines were mentioned, the language shifted quickly from feelings to efficiency, from loss to process. Everything was framed as keeping things clean, reasonable, fair. I was still moving slowly, still forgetting my mother was gone, while the conversation moved ahead without me. What startled me wasn't the paperwork itself, it was how prepared it all felt. How easily mourning was translated into terms like division and simplicity. I remember sitting there, listening, trying to keep up, when the conversation turned in a direction that made my chest tighten. The subject of my mother's estate entered the room, casually, like it had always belonged there. Suddenly, her life was being discussed as an asset, something to be accounted for. I felt the shift immediately, the way the air changes before a storm. It was explained as practicality, as how things worked when people were married, but underneath that calm explanation was pressure, subtle but unmistakable, a sense that time was important, that hesitation would complicate things. I felt fear then, sharp and clarifying, not just because of the money, but because of what it revealed. I heard my mother's voice in my head, reminding me to pay attention when people start counting what isn't theirs. That warning, once abstract, suddenly felt urgent and real. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I nodded and listened, storing away every detail. And when the conversation ended, I knew one thing with certainty. Grief had made me vulnerable, but it hadn't made me careless. If this was going to turn into a transaction, I wasn't going to navigate it alone. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The lawyer's office was quiet in a way that immediately slowed my breathing. Soft light, clean lines, no sense of urgency. It felt like stepping out of a storm and into a room where time moved at a human pace again. I realized how tense I'd been only after my shoulders dropped. I wasn't rushed. I wasn't interrupted. I was allowed to sit, to gather myself, to explain what had happened without being made to feel dramatic or unreasonable. Then came a single question, asked gently, almost casually, that cut straight through the noise. Had he mentioned my inheritance yet? My stomach tightened, but the answer came easily, yes. That was when the lawyer nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. He explained that my mother had come to see him months earlier, long before she got sick, long before anyone talked about separation. She had been calm, deliberate. She had planned. He slid a folder across the desk and explained the trust in simple, steady terms. Everything my mother left me had been placed there. It was protected, separate, untouchable. There was no loophole, no delay, no argument that could undo it. It had already been done. I felt the air rush out of my lungs, not from shock, but from release. The fear I'd been carrying loosened all at once, leaving space behind. Then he handed me a letter, written in my mother's familiar handwriting. She didn't talk about money. She talked about freedom, about safety, about choices. In that moment, I understood what she had really given me. Not leverage, not revenge, protection, the ability to stand without panic. When I left that office, nothing outside had changed, but inside, everything had. I wasn't bracing anymore. I was prepared, and for the first time since she died, I felt steady enough to walk back into my own life knowing I wasn't walking in blind. I walked back into the house carrying knowledge that changed everything, and I set it down quietly, like something fragile. Nothing looked different. The rooms were the same, the air felt the same, but I wasn't the same person who had left that morning. There is a strange weight that comes with knowing something the other person doesn't. It presses inward. It sharpens your attention. Every word, every glance, every pause suddenly feels louder. I realized how much I used to fill silence without thinking, and how deliberate silence could be instead. I chose calm. I chose to keep my voice steady, my questions neutral, my expressions unreadable. Not because I wanted to deceive, but because I needed to protect what had just been handed back to me. Honesty had always been my instinct. Transparency had always felt like safety. But in that moment, safety looked different. I could feel the urge to speak rise and fall inside me, to explain, to correct, to reveal that the ground had shifted. Each time, I let it pass. I watched him relax instead. I watched the tension in his shoulders ease, the careful politeness soften into something more assured. He believed the balance was tipping in his favor. That was when I understood something my mother had tried to teach me without ever saying it outright. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's time. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was waiting. And as the days settled into an uneasy calm, I could sense the next move forming. Just beyond the surface, the quiet wasn't peace. It was the pause before intention showed itself. Something shifted in him almost overnight. The careful distance disappeared. The polite restraint softened into ease. He moved through the house with a confidence that hadn't been there before, like the future had already agreed with him. I noticed it in the way he spoke about plans, about timing, about how things would work out once everything was settled. There was an optimism that didn't ask permission. It assumed alignment. His words weren't demands. They didn't need to be. They were framed as inevitabilities, as shared goals we had somehow already agreed on. That was the moment money stopped being abstract. It entered the room dressed up as partnership, as practicality, as something we would figure out together because that's what reasonable people do. Except I hadn't been asked. I had been included without consent. Inside, something tightened. Not fear. Recognition. I listened closely. Not to what he was saying, but to what he believed. He believed he was entitled to a future shaped by something that had never belonged to him. He believed my loss had created an opening. He believed my silence meant agreement. I felt anger rise, but it was clean, focused. It didn't cloud my thinking. It clarified it. This was the tone my mother had warned me about without naming. This was the moment she had been preparing me for. The point where respect quietly exits and entitlement takes its place. I realized then that he wasn't revealing a new side of himself. He was simply done hiding the old one, and just as clearly, I understood that I couldn't keep pretending either. The line had been crossed. Whether he knew it or not, the next step wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be internal. What he had treated as assumed was about to meet reality, and there would be no way to soften it anymore. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Nothing about it felt dramatic, which somehow made the tension sharper. This wasn't a place for raised voices or emotional leverage. It was a place where facts lived. He walked in confident, relaxed. He carried himself like someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. I could see it in his posture, in the way he settled into his chair, like he was about to confirm something he already owned. I sat across from him, hands steady, saying very little. I didn't need to prepare a speech. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just needed to listen. The lawyer moved through the information slowly and carefully, explaining timelines, documents, and legal boundaries in a calm, even tone. There was no accusation in it, no edge, just clarity. Piece by piece, the assumptions he had been operating under were quietly dismantled. I watched his expression change, not all at once. First confusion, then irritation, then something closer to disbelief. The certainty drained out of him as the reality settled in. What he thought was inevitable had never been possible. What he believed he could access had been protected long before he made his move. I felt a shift inside myself. Not triumph, relief, a solid sense of standing on ground that couldn't be pulled out from under me. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was simply present. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify anything. I stated my boundaries clearly and calmly, knowing they were already supported by law. That was enough. As we stood to leave, I understood something important. He wasn't losing money in that room. He was losing control, and once that illusion was gone, there was no way to get it back. The messages started arriving all at once, notifications lighting up my phone, names I hadn't heard from in years suddenly weighing in, asking careful questions or offering thinly veiled opinions. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized he had gone public, not with facts, but with a version of the story that made him look reasonable and me look cold. It was disorienting to see my life reframed by someone else. Private moments flattened into simple explanations, grief reduced to inconvenience. I felt the familiar urge rise in my chest, the need to correct the record, to explain myself clearly and finally so everyone would understand. I sat with that urge instead of acting on it. I remembered how quickly words could be twisted, how explanations could become ammunition. So I chose stillness. I didn't respond. I didn't defend. I documented everything quietly. Screenshots and dates and patterns, letting the truth collect weight on its own. Silence did something unexpected. The people who truly knew me didn't need convincing. They checked in without questions. They stayed present without commentary. Others revealed themselves just as clearly, drawn to noise instead of truth. There was hurt in that stretch of time, no question about it, but there was also a growing steadiness. I stopped measuring myself against a story that wasn't mine to manage. I focused on what I could control, on keeping myself grounded and prepared. The attention eventually slowed, but the air didn't fully settle. I could feel it shifting, tightening. His words had failed to restore control, and I understood then that he wouldn't stop trying. Whatever came next would not be about stories anymore. I knew something was wrong before I reached the door. The porch light was on when I hadn't left it that way. The air felt off, too quiet, like a room holding its breath. I stopped before unlocking anything and listened, every sense pulling forward at once. I didn't go inside. I stepped back, heart steady but loud in my ears, and made the call I never thought I'd have to make. I waited where I was, watching the dark windows, keeping distance between my body and whatever had already crossed a line. When I finally saw the inside, it was clear this wasn't chaos. It was intention. Drawers opened and left half closed. Personal things moved but not taken. Papers disturbed. Not stolen. It felt like a message written without words, meant to say, I can still reach you. Nothing of value was missing. That was the part that landed hardest. This wasn't about money, it was about presence, about control, about letting me know that privacy was something he could violate if he wanted to. I noticed my own reaction more than the damage. My hands were steady. My thoughts were narrow and precise. I cataloged instead of cried. I stood very still, as if making myself smaller might keep the moment contained. Later, alone in a safe place, the weight finally pressed down, not as panic, but as a heavy quiet, the kind that settles after something breaks in a way that can't be repaired. I didn't sleep much that night. Morning felt far away, but even in the dark, I understood something important. I wasn't alone anymore, even if it felt that way. And the next day would prove it. Morning came slowly. Like it wasn't sure I was ready for it. I felt emptied out, worn thin. Sitting in the quiet aftermath of a night that had taken more than it showed, I expected to face that day alone, bracing myself for the work of holding everything together again. I didn't. The first knock came gently, then another. People showed up without asking, without explanations. Neighbors, friends, old acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone brought coffee and just set it down. Someone else stayed to help clean. Not touching anything personal, just restoring order where it had been disrupted. No one pushed for details. No one demanded strength from me. They filled the space with normal things, conversation about weather, about schedules, about what my mother used to do in that same kitchen. Stories surfaced quietly. Small moments I hadn't known she'd left behind in other people's lives. It felt like discovering echoes of her everywhere, steady and familiar. What struck me most was how natural it all felt. This wasn't drama or rescue, it was belonging, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up anyway. As the hours passed, I felt something loosen in my chest. The fear didn't vanish, but it stopped dominating the room. I realized that whatever he had tried to do, it hadn't worked. I wasn't isolated, I wasn't erased. By the end of that day, I understood something clearly. Control depends on silence and separation, and neither of those belong to me anymore. After that night, everything moved into rooms with neutral walls and steady clocks. There were hearings, paperwork, signatures that mattered more than raised voices ever had. Protective boundaries were put in place, accountability followed. Not dramatically, but thoroughly. The process was clear, and once it started, it didn't stall. What surprised me was how small he seemed. Once the leverage was gone, no speeches, no bargaining, just absence, shrinking into the margins where power can't survive without access or fear. The system didn't need my anger to function. It only needed facts, timing, and truth. Once the legal reality was set, everything resolved quickly. There was no prolonged battle, no drawn-out spectacle. The outcome was straightforward and fair, not punitive, just final. I remember noticing how ordinary the days felt afterward, and how extraordinary that ordinariness was. The release didn't arrive as a rush. It came as a physical softening, shoulders dropping, breath deepening. The constant alertness I had been carrying finally stood down. I slept without listening for sounds. I walked without scanning rooms. Space opened up around me again. What stayed with me most was the calm. Justice didn't roar. It closed a door and locked it properly. I realized I wasn't standing on the other side of a victory. I was standing in something quieter and better. Freedom isn't the absence of conflict, it's the absence of control. And when that disappeared from my life, what remained felt clean, stable, and finally my own. With that space came the readiness to look back, not with fear, but with understanding, ready to name what had truly been left to me all along. When everything finally settled, I expected to feel different, stronger, maybe, or lighter in some dramatic way. What I felt instead was steady, like the ground under my feet had stopped shifting. For a long time, I thought inheritance was about money, about what gets passed down in accounts and documents. That's what everyone seems so focused on. But standing here now, with distance and clarity, I understand how wrong that idea was. What my mother really left me was protection. She left me the habit of paying attention, the courage to pause when something feels off, the understanding that love does not require self-erasure, and that patience should never cost safety. She didn't teach those lessons loudly. She lived them. She planned quietly. She watched carefully. And when she saw something I couldn't yet name, she prepared anyway. That preparation gave me time. It gave me space to choose myself without fear. It gave me freedom, not just from one person, but from the version of myself that believed endurance was the same as strength. I carry her with me now in a different way, in firmer boundaries, in clearer decisions, in the calm confidence of trusting my own judgment. I don't feel hardened by what happened. I feel sharpened, more aware of what I deserve and what I will never again excuse. If there's anything I hope stays with you from this story, it's this. Real inheritance isn't what someone can take from you. It's what no one else can touch. Your safety, your discernment, your sense of worth. If this resonated with you, I invite you to sit with your own story for a moment, and if you feel ready, share it. Sometimes naming what protected us, or what didn't, is how we begin to protect ourselves.